By the time the laughter reached the far end of Ravenshire Hall, Duke Adrian had already made the mistake that would one day cost him more than gold. Clara Whitmore stood alone before him, in a widow's black gown that had been mended so many times the seams were beginning to show. Only months earlier, she had possessed a respectable home, servants, and the protection of her husband's name. Now, her husband was dead. His debts had swallowed everything he left behind, and Clara had come to Ravenshire with one final hope: the pension owed for his years of service to the Duke. Instead, Adrian decided to give her something else. Before a hall filled with wealthy landowners, merchants, and titled families, he announced that Clara could have Thornwick Estate. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then someone laughed. Others quickly followed. Everyone in that room knew Thornwick. The manor had been abandoned for years. Rain entered through its roof. Its fields were choked with weeds. Its tenant cottages stood empty, and the great watermill beside the river had not turned in 15 years. One noble had once joked that even rats needed better accommodation. Adrian presented it as generosity, but everyone understood the insult. He was giving a penniless widow the worst property in his possession, so she would never return asking him for help. Clara understood it too. She could have refused. She could have walked away with what remained of her pride. Instead, she accepted the deed, and that was when Adrian should have become worried. Because Clara did not leave Ravenshire Hall looking defeated, she left studying the document in her hands. None of the laughing nobles noticed, neither did the Duke. 6 months later, some of those same men would stand inside a royal chamber, watching merchants choose Clara's goods over Adrian's. Before the year ended, Thornwick would become the one estate Ravenshire could no longer afford to ignore. But on that afternoon, Clara owned little more than ruins. She arrived at Thornwick before sunset, carrying one trunk and almost no money. Thomas Bell, the elderly caretaker who had remained after everyone else left, showed her collapsed fences, empty cottages, a flooded storehouse, and fields that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath years of neglect. He expected her to leave by morning. Clara nearly believed he was right. Then, while searching through the manor's forgotten account room, she discovered a small iron chest beneath a pile of rotting ledgers. Inside lay a document older than the Duke himself. It was a royal charter, and according to the faded seal at its bottom, Thornwick possessed something no neighboring estate could legally take away: permanent market rights and toll-free access to the river. Clara read the page twice. The ruined estate was not worthless. The Duke simply had never understood what he owned. Clara slept very little that first night. The royal charter lay on the table beside a single burning candle, while wind moved through cracks in the old manor walls. She read it again and again, as though the words might disappear by morning. Thornwick had a market, it had river access, and, for the first time since her husband died, Clara had something that had not yet been taken from her. The thought frightened her almost as much as it gave her hope. Her husband's illness had lasted nearly a year. By the time he died, the doctors had been paid, the servants dismissed, and letters from creditors had begun arriving faster than condolences. Clara had learned only afterward how much money he owed. She sold her jewelry first, then the furniture. Finally, she sold the house itself. Everything that had once made her life appear secure vanished piece by piece until all she had left could fit inside the trunk she had brought to Thornwick. So failure here would not mean returning somewhere else. There was nowhere else. The next morning, Thomas Bell found her walking the estate before sunrise. He told her what the abandoned ledgers did not. The land had never been barren. It had simply been ignored. Years earlier, several eastern fields had produced excellent flax. The river landing had once brought merchants directly to Thornwick, and the old mill, though silent for 15 years, had not collapsed. Its wheel was damaged, its gears rusted, but Thomas believed it could turn again. Clara spent the next 3 days studying account books. Numbers had never frightened her. During her marriage, her husband had often dismissed her opinions whenever visitors were present. Yet behind closed doors, it was Clara who balanced the household expenses, questioned poor investments, and discovered mistakes his clerks had overlooked. Now there was no husband to take credit for what she could do. There was also no money to waste. She calculated what little she had left and abandoned every grand idea immediately. The manor roof could wait. The empty gardens could wait. Even most of the cottages could wait. 3 things could not. The mill had to turn, flax had to be planted, and Thornwick's weekly market had to return. Clara began visiting families who had once lived on the estate. Most refused her. Some had heard too many promises from wealthy landowners. Others believed the Duke would eventually regret giving Thornwick away. One former tenant looked directly at her and asked what would happen when Adrian changed his mind. Clara placed the signed deed on the table between them. The estate was hers. She promised no miracles, only fair rent, honest measures, and wages paid when they were due. Lucy Bell was the first to believe her. Thomas's 17-year-old daughter signed her name beneath Clara's terms and agreed to help reopen the market. Others slowly followed. Within weeks, Clara had spent almost every coin she possessed. Seed went into the earth, repairs began at the mill, old stalls were dragged back into the market square. If the harvest failed, Thornwick would take her last chance with it. Then, one cold morning, Thomas released the repaired gate beside the river. Water rushed forward. The great wooden wheel shuddered once, then again, and slowly, after 15 silent years, it began to turn. Clara stood watching it gather speed. For the first time since arriving at Thornwick, she smiled. Now they would make the estate worth stealing back. The water wheel did not make Thornwick prosperous overnight. For the first few weeks, it merely made the estate look alive. That alone was enough to change something. On the first market day, only 12 stalls appeared in the square. A baker came from a nearby village. 2 farmers brought vegetables. An elderly woman sold candles. A traveling merchant arrived with cheap cloth and almost turned back when he saw how empty the place was. Clara bought nothing she did not need. She simply walked from stall to stall, spoke to every trader, and made certain each one understood the same thing. At Thornwick, the fees would be fair, the weights would be honest, and no merchant would pay hidden charges after arriving. The following week, there were 20 stalls. By the 4th week, there were 40. Then the river began doing what Clara had hoped it would do. Traveling merchants discovered that Thornwick's old charter allowed them to unload goods directly at the landing without paying the expensive road tolls demanded on other routes. Word spread quickly. Barges began appearing where reeds and silence had once ruled the riverbank. The flax fields took longer. Clara had expected that. While the first crop grew, she converted 2 empty storage rooms beside the mill into weaving rooms. She hired women who had lost husbands, laborers dismissed from neighboring estates, and families who had spent years moving from one uncertain harvest to another. Thomas kept the mill working. Lucy surprised everyone. She had spent years helping her father with repairs and household expenses. But Clara soon discovered that the girl could add columns of figures faster than most trained clerks. Before long, Lucy was recording market fees, deliveries, wages, and orders. And Clara introduced one rule that seemed almost embarrassingly simple. Every transaction was written down where the people involved could see it. No unexplained deductions, no wages delayed for months, no worker forced to guess what was owed. Thornwick did not become rich, but people began trusting it, and trust brought business. News eventually reached Ravenshire Hall. Adrian listened as Edmund Vane reported that Thornwick's weekly market had reopened and that several merchants were beginning to use its river landing. The Duke barely looked up from his papers. He told Edmund to let Clara enjoy her little market. To Adrian, it was still a widow's experiment. Edmund did not share his amusement. He knew exactly where some of those merchants had traded before, Ravenshire. A few days later, he arrived at Thornwick himself. His warning was wrapped in politeness. Expansion, he suggested, could attract attention. Competition with larger estates could create unnecessary difficulties. Clara understood him perfectly. She thanked him for his concern and continued expanding. Then came the opportunity that could change everything. A London merchant had seen samples of Thornwick linen and wanted a full shipment. The order was larger than anything Clara had received. If she delivered it successfully, the profit could keep the mill running, pay workers, finance the next planting, and secure Thornwick for almost an entire year. For 3 days, everyone worked without complaint. The finished linen was packed. The wagons were loaded. Clara watched them leave before sunrise. By midday, they returned. The drivers had been stopped at the Duke's Bridge. A new commercial toll had been imposed that very morning. Clara calculated the charge once. Then again, if she paid it, the London order would cost more to deliver than it would earn. Someone had known exactly when her wagons were leaving, and for the first time, Clara understood that Thornwick was no longer being ignored. Someone inside Ravenshire had decided it needed to be stopped. Clara did not ride to Ravenshire Hall to complain. She did not send a letter asking Adrian to remove the toll. Instead, she returned to the old charter. That night, she spread the document across the table, while Lucy copied figures beside her, and Thomas studied the faded boundaries drawn along the river. The Duke controlled the bridge, but he did not control the water beneath it. Thornwick's charter was unmistakable. Goods leaving from its river landing could travel without paying Ravenshire's commercial road tolls. By sunrise, Clara had made her decision. The linen would not travel by wagon. It would travel by barge. Thomas found 2 river captains willing to take the risk, and before midday, the first bundles were being carried down to the landing. The journey was slower than the road, but it cost far less. 3 days later, word arrived from London. The shipment had reached its buyer on time. The linen had sold, and the merchant wanted twice as much on the next order. That was the moment Thornwick stopped merely surviving. Work increased almost immediately. More looms were added to the weaving rooms. New families arrived looking for employment. Men who had spent years waiting months for wages on poorly managed estates began asking whether Thornwick had positions available. Clara did not promise wealth. She promised payment when payment was due. That was enough. Merchants followed the workers. The market square became crowded on trading days. Barges waited at the river landing. The mill wheel seemed never to stop turning. Eventually, Adrian could no longer dismiss the reports. He rode to Thornwick himself. Perhaps he expected to find Clara exhausted among ruins, fighting desperately to preserve a failing experiment. Instead, he heard the mill before he reached the manor. He saw carts lined beside repaired storehouses. He passed workshops filled with weavers. He watched barges being loaded along the river. And in the middle of it all stood Clara, speaking with 3 merchants as if Thornwick had always belonged to her. Adrian waited until they had gone. Then he asked whether she understood how much trade she was drawing away from Ravenshire. Clara looked at him calmly. She reminded him that he had given her the estate. He had never given her instructions to keep it poor. For a moment, Adrian said nothing. Then he warned her that success had a way of attracting enemies, especially when that success came at the expense of powerful men. Clara's expression did not change. Perhaps, she told him, poverty had never been the protection people claimed it was. The words followed Adrian, even after he turned toward his horse. Before leaving, he looked back across the market. 2 merchants he recognized immediately were standing beside Lucy, discussing prices. Both had once traded almost exclusively through Ravenshire. For the first time, Adrian felt something different from amusement. Concern. 3 days later, a sealed royal notice arrived at both estates. The Crown was opening competition for one of the kingdom's most valuable household supply contracts. For years, Ravenshire had secured a large share of that business, almost without challenge, but the new requirements favored estates with reliable production, river access, transparent accounts, and competitive prices. Thornwick met every one of them. Adrian read the notice twice. The penniless widow he had once tried to send away with a worthless estate was no longer asking him for anything. She was about to compete against him for the crown itself. The trouble began quietly enough that Clara almost mistook it for coincidence. First came the whispers. A merchant from the southern road arrived at Thornwick, looking uneasy, and asked whether it was true that Duke Adrian intended to reclaim the estate. By the following morning, 2 more traders had heard the same story. Clara dismissed it as gossip. Then the consequences began. A supplier who had always allowed 30 days for payment suddenly demanded his money immediately. Another refused to extend credit at all. Within a week, 3 important buyers cancelled orders without explanation. The market did not empty, but its confidence changed. People began watching the road toward Ravenshire as though expecting soldiers to appear. Then, a local magistrate arrived with an inspection order. One of Thornwick's largest warehouses, recently repaired and filled with prepared flax, was declared unfit for commercial use because of an obscure regulation concerning the width of its rear access passage. Clara argued that the building had passed inspection only months earlier. It made no difference. The doors were sealed. Almost overnight, the expansion she had fought so hard to create came to a halt. Workers began asking Lucy whether their wages were safe. Merchants hesitated before signing new contracts. Thomas finally told Clara what no one else wanted to say. If she continued spending at the same rate, Thornwick might not survive another month. For the first time since the water wheel had begun turning, Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her, and there was only one man powerful enough to make it happen so quickly. She rode to Ravenshire. Adrian received her in his study, and Clara wasted no time accusing him. He denied everything. He had issued no order to reclaim Thornwick. He had not instructed merchants to abandon her. He knew nothing about the warehouse inspection. Clara did not believe him. She reminded him how easily he had laughed when she was poor enough to be harmless. Now that Thornwick was succeeding, every road seemed to close. Adrian's temper finally broke. He told her that not every difficulty in her life had been arranged by him. Clara answered that perhaps he had never noticed how much power looked like coincidence when one was standing beneath it. Then she told him something that silenced the room. He had respected her only when she needed him. The moment she no longer did, he had begun calling her dangerous. Clara left before he could answer, but Adrian did not forget the accusation. That evening, he ordered every recent commercial notice issued in Ravenshire's name brought to him. He expected to prove Clara wrong. Instead, he found something else. Several orders involving bridge tolls, merchant restrictions, and inspections had never carried his authorization. They carried Edmund Vane's seal. At Thornwick, Lucy was making a discovery of her own. While comparing old merchant records with recent cancellations, she noticed the same names appearing again and again. Traders who abandoned smaller estates were later granted favorable terms through Ravenshire. Some had been forced into exclusive agreements, others had paid unexplained commissions, and beside several of those payments appeared the same initials, E.V. Clara stared at the records until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Edmund had been using Ravenshire's influence for years to control trade and quietly profit from it. Thornwick was not threatening only the Duke's business. It was threatening the system Edmund had built beneath his nose. And if Clara was right, the man trying to destroy her had been stealing from Adrian long before she ever arrived. Clara did not expose Edmund immediately. That would have been the easiest mistake to make. Instead, she spent the next several days building a case strong enough that no title, friendship, or influence could bury it. Lucy copied every suspicious payment from the old trading records. Thomas identified merchants who had once complained about being forced into exclusive agreements. Clara contacted them one by one, not asking for loyalty, but for written statements. Some refused, others were frightened, but several remembered how Thornwick had treated them when nobody else would. They agreed to help. Clara also studied the regulations used to close her warehouse. Buried beneath pages of commercial law, she found the detail Edmund had assumed no one would notice. The regulation applied only to newly constructed warehouses. Thornwick's building had stood for more than 60 years. The closure had never been legal. Armed with the original property records, the inspection notice, and written testimony from 2 builders, Clara challenged the magistrate's ruling formally. 3 days later, the seal was removed from the warehouse doors. Work resumed before sunset. Then, Clara turned to the merchants, who had cancelled their contracts. She did not beg them to return. She offered smaller orders, flexible delivery dates, and guaranteed prices backed by Thornwick's open accounts. Some remained cautious. Enough came back. The estate began breathing again. At Ravenshire, Adrian was conducting his own investigation. The deeper he looked, the worse it became. Edmund had hidden commissions inside shipping fees, redirected business through companies connected to his relatives, and used the Duke's authority to pressure smaller estates into dependence. Adrian had spent years believing that Ravenshire's dominance came from strength. Now he was forced to consider how much of it had come from fear, and that realization brought Clara back to his mind. She had built Thornwick without inherited influence, without powerful allies, and without forcing anyone to remain. People worked for her because she paid them. Merchants returned because they trusted her. Adrian had once considered those things ordinary. Now he understood how rare they were. Still, Clara wanted nothing from him. When Adrian sent word offering to deal with Edmund privately, she refused. This was no longer a disagreement between two estates. There were merchants who had lost businesses, workers who had lost wages, and families who had been driven from land because of Edmund's schemes. The truth would have to survive daylight. Edmund realized what was happening before Clara was ready to confront him. His response was immediate. A petition appeared before the regional court claiming that Adrian's transfer of Thornwick had never been intended as permanent ownership. According to Edmund, the estate had merely been provided for Clara's temporary support. If the court accepted that argument, everything she had built could return to Ravenshire. For one terrible hour, even Clara wondered whether she had finally reached the end. Then Lucy remembered the document Clara had carried from Ravenshire Hall on the day everyone laughed at her. The original deed. Clara unfolded it across the table. There were no conditions, no time limit, no restriction against commerce. Adrian's signature stood beneath every word. The very document meant to send her away had become the strongest protection she possessed. When the matter was raised publicly, Adrian had only one honest answer. Thornwick belonged to Clara, completely. Edmund's challenge collapsed. And before the shock had faded, another letter arrived. This one bore the royal seal. Clara opened it slowly. The Crown had reviewed Thornwick's production records and invited the estate to compete for the royal household supply contract. For years, that contract had been one of the foundations of Ravenshire's commercial power. Now Clara had been invited to take part of it. She looked toward the turning mill beyond the window. She was no longer fighting to keep the estate Adrian had discarded. She was about to stand beside him, before the Crown, and prove that Thornwick belonged among the most powerful estates in the kingdom. The royal evaluation took place 3 weeks later in a chamber large enough to make even wealthy landowners feel small. Merchants stood beside noble families. Crown officials sat behind long tables covered with ledgers, samples, contracts, and sealed reports. Representatives from several estates had been invited, but everyone knew where the real contest lay. Ravenshire had supplied the royal household for years. Thornwick had existed as a serious competitor for barely months. Some of the same men who had laughed when Clara accepted the ruined estate were there. This time, no one laughed when she entered. Adrian presented first. Ravenshire's figures were impressive. Its warehouses were larger. Its name carried generations of influence. Its production capacity exceeded nearly every estate in the region, and several officials clearly expected the familiar result before the evaluation had even begun. Then Clara's turn came. She did not speak about losing her husband. She did not mention arriving at Thornwick with one trunk. She did not ask anyone to admire what she had survived. She presented numbers. Thornwick's linen had fewer rejected shipments. Its river route reduced transportation costs. Its delivery records showed fewer delays. Every wage, purchase, and merchant payment could be traced through open accounts. More importantly, Clara demonstrated that Thornwick could increase production without reducing wages or forcing workers into debt. The chamber became quieter as she continued. One noble who had laughed the loudest at Ravenshire Hall stared at the documents before him as if struggling to reconcile them with the woman he remembered. Months earlier, he had watched Clara receive what everyone considered a useless gift. Now Crown officials were comparing her estate directly with the dukes. Then everything changed. A royal auditor entered, carrying another set of papers. The investigation into Edmund Vane had uncovered contracts signed in Ravenshire's name, containing fraudulent commissions, coercive trading terms, and unauthorized payments. Because Adrian's estate had benefited from some of those agreements, the Crown considered disqualifying Ravenshire entirely. The room erupted in whispers. Adrian stood motionless. If Ravenshire were removed, Thornwick would almost certainly win the largest portion of the contract. Clara needed only to remain silent. For months, Adrian's world had underestimated her, obstructed her, and nearly destroyed everything she built. No one could have blamed her for taking the victory. Instead, Clara stepped forward. She produced the copies Lucy had prepared, along with the merchant statements and records Adrian had uncovered inside Ravenshire. Together, they showed something important. Edmund had acted through the Duke's commercial authority, but several of the fraudulent orders had been issued without Adrian's knowledge or signature. Clara could not prove Adrian had managed his estate wisely. She could prove he had not ordered Edmund's crimes. One official asked why she would submit evidence that helped the man competing against her. Clara answered simply, if Thornwick was going to defeat Ravenshire, it would do so because it deserved to, not because another man had lied in the Duke's name. Adrian looked at her differently after that. For perhaps the first time, he understood the distance between them. He had inherited power and assumed that made him strong. Clara had possessed almost nothing and still managed to build loyalty without demanding it. The Crown separated Edmund's fraudulent dealings from the legitimate portions of Ravenshire's submission. The competition continued. Hours later, the decision was announced. Ravenshire retained part of the royal contract, but not all of it. A major share was awarded to Thornwick for its quality, for its costs, for its delivery record, and for the reliability of its accounts. Clara had not been handed victory. She had earned it. As the chamber emptied, Adrian approached her. Months earlier, she had stood before him as a penniless widow, asking for what was owed to her. Now he stood before the owner of the estate that had just taken part of his most valuable contract. He admitted that when he gave her Thornwick, he believed he was giving away his worst property. Clara looked at him calmly. He had not given away his worst property. He had given away the one he had never bothered to understand. Across the room, merchants were already waiting to speak with her, and for the first time in generations, Ravenshire had a rival powerful enough to make the Duke look across his own borders and wonder what Clara Whitmore would do next. Thornwick did not return to silence after the royal decision. It grew louder. Within months, the once-abandoned river landing was crowded with barges carrying linen toward London and returning with grain, tools, and new orders. The market, that had begun with 12 uncertain stalls, now filled the square every week. Families moved back into cottages that had stood empty for years, and smoke rose once again from chimneys across the estate. The old mill turned from sunrise until evening, but the greatest change was not measured in wagons or money. It was visible in the people. Workers who had once waited months to be paid now knew exactly what they earned. Widows who had depended on relatives were earning wages of their own. Children who had expected to leave Thornwick in search of work were watching their parents build lives there instead. Thomas Bell became the estate's permanent manager. Lucy, whose talent with figures had helped expose Edmund's corruption, was placed in charge of Thornwick's commercial accounts, while Clara arranged for her to continue her education. Edmund himself was removed from every position of authority and faced investigation over the money he had taken and the merchants he had pressured for years. And Clara? The woman who had once entered Ravenshire Hall, wearing a repaired morning dress, was now invited into rooms where people had once laughed at her. Only now, they waited for her opinion. She never forgot who had laughed, but she did not waste her victory humiliating them in return. Thornwick was enough. Adrian changed too. He could not undo the arrogance that had led him to give Clara the estate as an insult, but he stopped pretending that birth and wealth automatically made a man wiser than everyone beneath him. Months after the royal contract was awarded, he returned to Thornwick. Not with lawyers, not with threats, with a business proposal. Ravenshire needed linen for one of its trading houses, and Adrian wanted Thornwick to supply it. Clara read his offer carefully. Then she rejected the price. Adrian stared at her for a moment before an unwilling smile appeared. For the first time, they negotiated as equals. When the agreement was finally settled, they walked toward the river together. Across the water stood repaired cottages, busy workshops, loaded barges, and the mill that had once been silent for 15 years. Adrian looked over the land he had discarded. He admitted that he had given her his poorest estate. Clara watched the water wheel turning. No, she told him. He had given her the one thing he had never expected her to have, a beginning. And perhaps that was why Thornwick became so powerful. It had been built by people everyone else had underestimated. If you enjoy stories of forgotten women who rise against impossible odds, powerful dukes forced to face their mistakes, royal betrayals, hidden fortunes, and victories no one sees coming, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Because sometimes the thing people throw away becomes the very thing they can never defeat.